fantasy sports have become an integral part of the American professional sport experience. In 2015, over 56 million people participated in fantasy sports in the United States and Canada. While many platforms offer expert analysis to help participants pick the best players for the winningest team, users have to sift through these articles to find the subjective reasons why each analyst picked players and weigh whether or not they agree with these analysts' opinions. This process can be very burdensome for people who are not willing to spend the time researching, but would still like to experience the thrills associated with winning money or matches on a fantasy sport league. The seemingly high barrier to entry could potentially hinder the growth of fantasy sport platforms' user bases. For this project, our team sought to determine if a model could define which players will be the most valuable to draft in a fantasy sports league. Due to our love for the outstanding sport of basketball, we chose to look at NBA statistics and compare them against fantasy basketball draft results to find a relationship. From this relationship, we hope to be able to use a model to determine a player's chances of being drafted and the impact a player's statistics have on their drafting position. Fantasy sports participants will be able to use our models to quickly draft players to their fantasy teams. Fantasy sports are leagues in which participants draft a team comprised of players from any team in that professional sport. The participant gains points for the performance of each individual player on the team, and the cumulative score is pitched in a match against a rival in the participants' league. In recent years, fantasy sports have seen a huge uptake in gambling due to the emergence of daily fantasy sports. These daily leagues post large revenues each year. In 2014, DraftKings showed $40 million in revenue, and FanDuel showed $57 million in revenue. These numbers show how much value people place on fantasy sports. Even when gambling is not a factor, there is a lot of value in the industry for advertisers because of the large base of consumers. Fantasy leagues are poised to profit from daily fantasy in so many ways. They can sell their data to fans, sell more advertising and signage in and out of their arenas, and command more for television rights. In order to properly analyze these statistics, our group needed to find sources to scrape with Python code that would allow us to compare aggregated stats for each player in the NBA. ESPN.com was the best option and offered projected draft statistics for the 2015 season. We next needed to find the actual draft positions of players from the 2015 fantasy draft. ESPN.com still offered the best option for this, with a complete list of draft positions for both snake and auction drafts. The statistics scraped from ESPN.com are the same statistics used to calculate points in a fantasy basketball match. A player is assigned points for each of these elements: field goal percentage, free throw percentage, three-pointers made, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, and points. During a normal match, the player is assigned a point value for each of these elements that helps or hurts their performance in the fantasy matchup. The statistics pulled from ESPN.com were projected averages for that player for the 2015 season. A typical fantasy basketball participant will evaluate these averages to determine how many points that player is likely to gain them in each match. The statistics scraped from ESPN.com's live draft results offers insights into the average snake draft position or auction value at which each player was drafted. There are 520 players in our raw data from ESPN, but we dropped some player information due to missing values and end up having data for 351 players. Once we narrowed the data to these players, we looked at box plots to compare the statistics for players who are drafted and non-drafted in the fantasy leagues. Based on these box plots, if we look at the data for field goal percentage and free throw percentage, there seems to be no difference between the drafted and non-drafted players. However, if you look at the point box plot, there is a large difference between drafted and non-drafted players. The same goes for rebounds, steals, and three-pointers made. Next, we looked at the correlation across the 8 statistics. The matrix shows that there is a strong correlation across almost all of the independent variables. Specifically, points are strongly correlated with field goal percentage, free throw percentage, rebounds, assists, and steals. This means that the more points a player makes, he is more likely to have higher values for those statistics. In order to look at the relationship between the 8 statistics and the probability of being drafted, we used a logit model. The results of this model are displayed on the screen. Because we used a logit model, these results are interpreted as the odds of a player being drafted based on each statistic. From this model, we can conclude that even though fantasy basketball scores players on all 8 statistics, fantasy participants drafted players based on their performances related to rebounds, steals, and points. Next, we investigated what variables impact the auction values of a player. The most significant variables in this model were field goal percentage, blocks, steals, and points. The results of this model are also displayed on the screen. This tells us that players who are more aggressive in their actions on the court have higher fantasy draft values. We can assume that this is because aggressive players see more TV time and gain more attention for their actions, thus affecting the perceptions of people who watch basketball. So what does this all mean? We can create a model for fantasy sport platforms to allow their participants to more easily understand or predict which players they should have on their teams. This can be used to lower the barrier to entry for people who are less likely to play due to the higher level of knowledge associated with making good decisions on who to draft to a team. With the gaining popularity of daily fantasy leagues and the already massive scale of fantasy sports, fantasy platforms are constantly looking for new ways to increase their customer base and give their customers an advantage over other players. From the statistical analysis, we can offer a new way for these platforms to lower the barrier to entry as well as increase the reliance on their predicting models to create a better experience for fantasy sports participants. Because of the significant increase in revenues earned via the daily leagues, this area of the fantasy sports business is very attractive for our models to be applied. Fast tools to predict or determine which player to draft on a fantasy team can increase customer usage as well as customer base. Fantasy sports platforms can also generate revenue by selling this tool to their customers. Fantasy sports participants are willing to spend money on these, exemplified by the average $465 spent per year on contest fees and materials. While our analysis isn't exactly novel, the models presented can help many ill-informed fantasy sports participants experience winning games and potentially introduce their friends to play in leagues with them. Thank you.